This is chapter 13 of Friedrich Pollock, the Éminence Grise of the Frankfurt School by Philipp Lenhard. Chapter 13 is titled Automation. In times of war, needs must, and during the Second World War, enormous funds funded into numerous, often long-standing research and development projects that promised, if channeled appropriately, to be of immediate benefit to the war effort. A frequently cited case in point is the electronic numerical integrator and computer ENIAC, ENIAC, developed under the auspices of J. Presper Eckert Jr. and John W. Mulhey, to help with the calculation of ballistic trajectories. Completed in the final year of the war, it was for a decade the only fully electronic computer in use in the United States and provided an important platform for the development of programming. This in turn paved the way for the utilization of computers in industrial production processes. They allowed for increased batch quantities to be produced using significantly less and less skilled labor and made administrative services simpler and more efficient. Conversely, engineers and other technical staff were all the more hotly sought after. It was not long before the term automation made the rounds, denoting the creation of closed production systems in which human labor potentially became superfluous. Ultimately, it was envisaged only a small number of technicians and supervisors would be required to run and oversee the computers and robots. A veritable second industrial revolution seemed to be unfolding, raising numerous issues first debated in the United States, where it had progressed the furthest. From there, this debate spread to Europe. In June 1955, a conference with the title The Automatic Factory, What Does It Mean?, organized by the Institution of Production Engineers, Great Britain, took place in Margate. At the same time, maybe that's not Great Britain, it just says parenthesis GB, I should say that, parenthesis GB in parenthesis, took place in Margate. At the same time, the German trade union movement became increasingly concerned about the impact of automation. John F. Kennedy's Manpower Development and Training Act of 1962 provided millions for the retraining of skilled workers rendered redundant by automation, clearly indicated that the massive structural impact of automation was now universally acknowledged. Needless to say, Pollock, as the Institute's economist and prognostician, was highly alert to these far-reaching developments. Pollock contributed to the first volume of the Institute's new publication series. A Festschrift to Max Horkheimer's 60th birthday was an 80-page essay on automation in USA, Betrachtungen zur zweiten industriellen Revolution, end quote, or Automation in the USA, Reflections on the, quote, Second Industrial Revolution, end quote. Pollock distinguished it between Automatisierung, parenthesis, the regular German term for automation, and, quote, automation with a capital A. The former encompassed the individual automation measures, the latter the outcome of the process overall. For Pollock, automation in this comprehensive sense amounted to a new mode of production in which human labor became, potentially at least, entirely redundant. Quote, in the operation, direction and supervision of machines, quote, automation, end quote, as a production technique seeks to replace human labor by machines to such an extent that not a single human hand touches the product in the course of the entire production process, end quote. While the subject had previously been treated in entrepreneurial and engineering periodicals, and, as Pollock expressly acknowledged, in science fiction literature, his was the first substantive scholarly analysis of automation published in German. At the time, one of the few points of reference in terms of sociological analysis of automation was the extraordinarily prescient Problème humain du mécanisme industriel by George Friedman, a former assistant of the Institute's Paris branch. First published in 1946, an English translation, Industrial Society, The Emergence of Human Problems of Automation, came out in 1955. Pollock published his scholarly magnum opus, Automation Materialien sur Beu- Beurteilung der ökonomischen und sozialen Folgen. Automation, a study in its economic and social consequences, with the Europäische Verlagsanstalt the following year. It became Pollock's greatest success. Never before had Pollock encountered anything close to the level of attention Pollock now drew, public and academic. Pollock suddenly received endless invitations from conferences or conference organizers, gave television interviews, and was consulted by trade unions interested in Pollock's assessment of economic developments. A comprehensively updated edition of the book, added a further 100 pages, was published in 1964 and reissued again in 1966. These two editions ran to 14,000 copies in total. Additional editions were brought about by the Bucher-Gilde Gutenberg and other trade union licensees. The book was translated into Italian in 1956, English in 1957, French 1957, Dutch 1957, Spanish 1959, and Japanese 1959, and it featured prominently in German publications of record such as Der Spiegel and the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. In 1964, a special issue of Der Spiegel on the topic called Pollock, quote, Germany's leading scholar of automation, end quote. It quoted Pollock as insisting against the proponents of the social market economy, quote, that for Europe, at least preparing for a planned economy is still a matter of life and death, end quote. Pollock also contributed to a widely discussed volume for a general readership, Revolution der Roboter, parenthesis, Revolution of the Robots, end parenthesis. The volume drew on a lecture series organized by the Circle of Social Democratic Academics in Munich, sometimes described by observers as a German version of the Fabian Society. Alongside Pollock, the authors included Fritz Erler, a close associate of Willy Brandt, who later became Prime Minister of the Federal Republic, and Alfred Weber. In his review of the book, published in the intellectually aspirational weekly, Die Zeit, Hans Gressmann paid particular parenthesis, critical and parenthesis, attention to Pollock's contribution. Quote, in a fascinating contribution, the economist Friedrich Pollock, one of the few authorities on automation, seeks to demonstrate with scientific means that automation, if left to the caprice and whim of individual entrepreneurs, will inevitably lead to technological unemployment, end quote. Pollock was indeed convinced that automation would render millions of workers redundant. To be sure, he acknowledged that the impact of the, quote, electronic brains, end quote, was not all bad. It was, quote, freeing the assembly line worker from the soul-destroying drudgery of the conveyor belt, end quote. Yet it also led to, quote, an ever-increasing number of other workers, drifting into equally dull and monotonous jobs, end quote. The crucial point, then, was not to let automation simply take its course, but to find political solutions for the problems automation inevitably entailed. At this juncture, Pollock's decades-old predilection for the planned economy came into play once again. Whether in its socialist or democratic variant, Pollock remained convinced that only a planned economy offered a solution to humankind's problems. It is this conviction that marks the fundamental constant across all of Pollock's scholarly and political works. As he wrote in Automation, the book, quote, the object of economic planning must be to integrate automation with a free and democratic society. Success in such planning would mean that the Second Industrial Revolution could help to establish a social system based upon reason, end quote. Failing this, the world faced the consequences the founding father of cybernetics, Robert Wiener, had presciently outlined: mass unemployment, the demise of numerous skills and professions, and a massive economic crisis that, on Pollock's account, might well dwarf the Great Depression of the 1930s. Pollock's readership knew only too well what this meant. A renewed catastrophic economic crisis might very well spell the return of fascism. Presenting his path-breaking monograph, cybernetics or control and communication in the animal and the machine. To quote the world of Belsen and Hiroshima, end quote, in 1948, Norbert Wiener, whose father was a Jewish immigrant from Bialystok of notable rabbinic lineage, expressed grave concerns that the new methods might be harnessed to serve tyrannical ends. Pollock shared these misgivings. Quote, "It may be worth at this point," end quote, he wrote, quote, "to draw attention once more to the risks involved in letting automation simply run its course, regardless of its social consequences. Wherever private economic profit beckons, because one fails to recognize the limits of the market economy's capacity for self-regulation, with an obliviousness akin to that of the sorcerer's apprentice, those who do so might set in motion forces that no benign sorcerer will stop in time. The social upheaval that might be precipitated by an overly hasty introduction of automation would pave the way for a tyranny armed with unprecedented resources," end quote. Should computers be equipped with the ability to anticipate human conduct or calculate psychological response patterns, this would place totalitarian states on a whole new footing in terms of the techniques at their disposal when it came to the central task of, quote, "molding public opinion," end quote. For Pollock, what many considered the unprecedented manipulation of voters in the U.S. presidential election of 2016 by Russian hackers would have been old hat. As he noted in the second updated edition of 1964, the Democrats deployed high-powered computers in the 1960 presidential campaign to gauge potential voters' responses to various factors. This ability to make reliable predictions turned computers into a means of subjugation, and the resulting transformation of voters into transparent consumers of political propaganda posed a substantial threat to democracy. If the manipulation of the masses had progressed this far in the United States, where democracy was firmly established, Pollock dreaded to think what havoc it might wreak in countries where less stable democracies, with less stable democracies, or none. He therefore took it upon himself to help avert this renewed totalitarian threat by alerting the world to it as best he could. Far from sharing the enthusiasm of the U.S. entrepreneur John Diebold, who is credited with coining the term automation, Pollock feared the emergence of a dictatorship of the experts. Drawing on Huxley once more, Pollock outlined what can only be described as a dystopian account of the automated society. Quote, "At the top of the social pyramid we will find an economic general staff as the true master of both machines and of men," end quote, he wrote. Quote, "Only this relatively small group, together with its, quote, officer corps," end quote, "will be able fully to grasp technical and economic processes and make economic policy decisions, ... Since everything seems to become calculable, such an elite engages in manipulation as a matter of course, is likely to view the masses who are undiscerning, easily swayed by the means of modern propaganda, and assuaged by access to the swelling flow of consumer goods, with considerable contempt. The role of the officer corps in the army would be played in this society by the engineers, administrators, research staff, and technicians versed in the handling of human beings. Right down to the officers' underlings, the members of this group need to own considerable specialist skills and be able to think for themselves," end quote. Yet the, quote, "constructive imagination," end quote, of these officers too would be needed only until the, quote, "machines construct new machines under their own steam," end quote. What Pollock was describing was the administered world he and his colleagues had begun to identify in their discussion of Huxley in the 1940s, and whose conceptualization featured in Adorno's negative dialectic, negative dialectics, and crucially shaped the New Left's reception of Adorno. It principally fell to Pollock to provide the underpinning in the realm of economic theory for Adorno's cultural philosophy, and thus tie the works of the post-war era back to those of the 1940s. In this context, Pollock and Horkheimer now adjusted the racket theory to apply it to the domination of the experts. The concepts of the administered world entailed the assumption that closed groups of experts who monopolized access to social wealth. The concept of the administered world entailed the assumption that closed groups of experts also monopolized access to social wealth. Unlike that of the fascists, their power was based not on brute force, but on privileged knowledge that also found expression in their reliance on technical jargon. Only the initiated were able to join the elite. In this respect, too, Pollock looked to the United States, where he felt that relevant developments had progressed the furthest. In fact, all his assumptions about future economic and social developments in Europe seemed to be predicated on the state of play in the USA. In this respect, he was not unlike Marx, who assigned much the same role to England. Only rarely did Pollock take developments in Britain, Germany, or the Soviet Union into account, although Pollock did append a further section on automation in Europe to the second edition of the book. He also relied almost entirely on Anglo-American research literature. The guiding lights of his earlier intellectual endeavors, Marx, Engels, Hilferding, and Lenin, were nowhere to be seen. Only initiated readers would sense the continuing esoteric influence on his thought, such as it was. Pollock's research also shaped his teaching. In the winter semester of 1954-55, Pollock lectured on the theory of full employment. A year later, Pollock offered a course on the Second Industrial Revolution and a tutorial on automation. Pollock's final lecture course in the summer semester of 1956 dealt with, quote, the economic and social significance of automation in production and administration, end quote. He then took a number of sabbatical semesters. In 1959, Pollock was at last promoted to a regular full professorship. Pollock was finally able to retire in 1964. In the intervening years, his teaching and administrative duties having been substantially reduced, Pollock began to work on a new theory of productive labor that he was unable to bring to fruition. Among Pollock's papers are various notes collected under the heading, quote, Marxist problems, end quote, that range from excerpts to draft definitions and provisional outlines. Pollock wanted the envisaged book to cover three interconnected topics. Firstly, Pollock was working on an extension of the concept of productive labor designed to incorporate the service industry, i.e., quote, all human labor expended for goods and services that fulfill a social need, end quote. This was Pollock's response to the problem that as long as one limited the concept of productive labor to the production of material goods alone, it became increasingly inexplicable how the entire surplus value was supposedly being extracted from the labor of a constantly diminishing share of the workers. He was determined, in short, to develop a post-industrial labor theory. Secondly, Pollock was intent on formulating a critique of the canonical theories of imperialism developed by Lenin, Luxemburg, and Grossman. Quote, imperialist offensives, end quote, Pollock wrote, were triggered, quote, not by lack of M, bracket, surplus value, end bracket, but, parenthesis, according to Friedrich Pollock, end parenthesis, by the absolute unavoidability of the alternative, expansion or regression, end quote. In other words, imperialism was not a form of spoliation resorted to by monopoly capitalism when it was in trouble, but an innate feature of the capital relation. Money only acted as capital, after all, when money served the extraction of surplus value from labor. In a market economy, the realization of the surplus value transpired through the sale of produced goods. As automation rapidly inflated the mass of goods, so too the need for ever-expanding markets arose. This rendered the search for new markets increasingly global and inclined states to secure markets with political or military means. Where colonialism and classical imperialism had been based on the control of territories, imperialism was now all about access to markets. Thirdly, Pollock intended his labor theory to offer a critique of Marx's anthropology, which, as we saw, was of crucial import to Marcuse in particular. Pollock was critical of the vitalistic resonances in Marcuse's call for a renewed anthropology and its compatibility with Heidegger's critique of technology. Pollock associated Marx's, quote, sensualist materialism, end quote, of the 1840s and its ahistorical essentialization of labor as a human activity squarely with, quote, Marx before Marxism, end quote. It predated the focus of Marx's mature thought on the specific form and function of labor in capitalism. While sections of the New Left too began to idealize the working class in naive, and in the German case, as far as National Socialism was concerned, apologetic ways, seeking to reinstate it as the revolutionary subject, Pollock remained firm in his skepticism. Following the Hard Hat riot of May 1970, when 200 unionized construction workers attacked a student protest against the Vietnam War and injured some 70 protesters, Pollock characterized the incident in a letter to Martin J. as a, quote, symptom of what can be expected from the, quote, proletarian, end quote. Pollock also returned to crisis theory. Moreover, Pollock apparently intended to publish a volume of notes recording conversations with Horkheimer that he collated under the title ʻpʒlɛk, parenthesis, Swarf, end parenthesis. Now that he was free to focus on the world's problems as he saw fit, he was full of energy and enterprise. With his move to Montagnola and the unsettling state of suspended animation between New York, Los Angeles, and Frankfurt had finally come to an end, in 1959, following Khrushchev's infamous Berlin Ultimatum, Pollock and Horkheimer did acquire an emergency residence in Stamford, parenthesis, Connecticut, end parenthesis, that they kept until 1961. Yet this undertow of unease, typical of many former émigrés, aside, they felt well in Ticino. They loved the landscape and went on long walks or hiking almost daily, frequently spending the evenings together in one or other of their adjacent houses of their shared garden. As Nicola Emery has shown, they had paid considerable attention to the aesthetics of their new interior, discussing the architectural features of their new domicile at great length. They occasionally hosted guests and continued to travel to Frankfurt, Los Angeles, and Chicago, but they finally had plenty of time again to debate and analyze each other. These mutual analyses have left some traces in ʻpʒlɛk, mainly in the form of Horkheimer's assessments of Pollock. For example, a note from December 1963 treats their respective character traits. It refers to Pollock, who usually features as Y in the conventional documents, but in this case was identified as Z, as inclining towards, quote, negativism, i.e., only negative objects carry a libidinous charge. A wall separates conscious intention and action from the libido structure, end quote. In the minutes of a conversation in August 1962, Pollock holds forth on historical grounds against Horkheimer's contention that the communist revolution would have been possible at any point in time, only to be told that he was a positivist in the vein of Wittfogel and Neumann. They also discussed religion. Pollock maintained that neither traditional religion nor the, quote, Western substitute religions, end quote, such as socialism, communism, or the bourgeois faith in progress were still credible. Ultimately, people only cared about consumption and unabashed satisfaction of their needs. In this context, as in his private notes during the war, Pollock clearly veered towards nihilistic cultural pessimism. His take on Judaism was no exception. Unlike Horkheimer, Pollock considered it a, quote, terrible misfortune, end quote, that, quote, the Jews did not cease to be a people following the victory of the early medieval church and assimilate into their host peoples, ... innumerable individuals would have been spared untold suffering, end quote. Prior to the emergence of racial anti-Semitism, it had still been possible to evade persecution by conversion, but the instilled sense of being a separate people had obstructed this way out. Precisely what Horkheimer admired about Jewry, that it had stuck together, the, quote, utmost sacrifices, end quote, notwithstanding, and despite lacking any, quote, hope of being rewarded, end quote, irked Pollock. Quote, the Jewish tragedy, end quote, he wrote, quote, which sprang from submission to a law inextricably linked to an ultimately alien tribal history, bears testimony to the lethal impact of a tradition based on earliest childhood experiences, end quote. Pollock's radical eschewal of imposed traditions, in this case the Jews', quote, tribal history, end quote, seems to be diametrically opposed to Horkheimer's messianism. For Horkheimer, it was precisely halakha, Jewish law, that epitomized the dynamic spirit of Judaism and its quest for reconciliation. Of course, neither of them genuinely approached Judaism as a religion. For them it was a tradition, and as Jews they were forced to position themselves vis-a-vis this tradition one way or another. Pollock had learnt in the course of his life that the one thing one could not do was ignore it. As a young man he had felt indifferent about his Jewishness, considered it a mere biographical coincidence. The National Socialists robbed him of this indifference turning him against his will into a, quote, full Jew, end quote. Thus he was forced to reflect on his stance vis-a-vis his Jewishness in a context of persecution. Subjectively, however, although he differentiated between Judaism and Jewishness, his basic indifference survived the Shoah. Even in old age, he maintained that there was, quote, ultimately nothing very Jewish, end quote, about him, that he lacked any relation to Jewish ritual and felt no great affinity for Jewish thought. In contrast to Heinrich Grossmann, whom he repeatedly credited with a, quote, Talmudic, end quote, way of thinking, his own Jewishness, as he wrote to Martin J. shortly before his death, did not extend beyond his ethnic origin. Yet what are we to make of this? In 1960, because Horkheimer had been taken ill, Pollock was forced to give a formal address at the central ceremony to mark the 10th anniversary of the establishment of the Central Council of Jews in Germany, the official representative body of Jews living in West Germany. His performance on this occasion gives an indication of the complicated and torturous nature of Pollock's attitude towards his own Jewishness. Pollock copiously avoided any use of the word, quote, we, end quote, presenting himself as an objective social scientist speaking on issues of political education. Among the problems he identified was the stereotyping of entire groups, parenthesis, quote, the end quote, American, quote, the Frenchman, quote, the Jew, end quote, in parenthesis, which Pollock insisted was equally problematic, regardless of whether the implications of the cliches deployed were assumed to be negative or positive. Acting as a reader for an edited collection on anti-Semitism, he chastised one of the contributors, the German-American economist Hans Wolfram Gerhardt, as falling into the category of, quote, the anti-Semitic, quote, Jew lover, end quote, intent on, quote, being party to the, parenthesis, waning, end parenthesis, pro-Jewish mode, end quote. His text was a, quote, pointless ragbag of liberal economic theories and tidbits from economic history, assembled along the lines of, quote, only the very best, sir, end quote, end quote. His equal contempt for ostentatious Philo-Semites and anti-Semites, parenthesis, suddenly a startlingly rare breed, end parenthesis, may help explain the emergence of his interest in serious historical accounts of the Shoah. Pollock was deeply impressed by Gerald Reitlinger's pioneering book, The Final Solution. Only this kind of exact reconstruction had the potential to circumvent stereotypes and lead to a differentiated understanding, he felt. When he wrote to Juan Pollock in 1961 that, quote, the horrors of the Nazi years, end quote, were, quote, inconceivable even now, end quote, he added, quote, when you come over, I will let you, Hans, browse my small library on this topic. Women should not read these books. I've also asked Carlotta not to look at them, end quote. Pollock evidently assumed that these accounts were too shocking for women to bear. When gifting an edition of Shoah-related documents to the 19-year-old student Emil Walter Busch, who assisted him with the revised edition of Automation, his dedication read, quote, for Emil Walter Jr., that he may gain a sense of what human beings are capable of in the mid-20th century, end quote. In 1960, the municipal authorities in Stuttgart commissioned the city archivist Maria Seltzer to prepare a volume commemorating the city's former Jewish citizens. To this end, she contacted various former Jewish inhabitants of the city, including Horkheimer and Pollock. In response, Pollock made a serious effort to ascertain what had happened to his own relatives. Quote, please let me know, end quote. He wrote to Juan and Ida Pollock in February 1961, quote, what dates you have for Sally, bracket Stern, and bracket Alfred, Frank, Sigmund, and Ruzel Nerdlinger. The year of deportation is of particular interest. These are, alas, not our only murdered relatives, but the people in Stuttgart are interested only in those who still lived in Stuttgart in 1933, end quote. The Pollock brothers' maternal uncle, Alfred Frank, who became one of the suitcase factory's authorized signatories in 1914, was taken to Theresienstadt in 1942 and perished there within a fortnight. Ida Pollock's half-sister, Johanna Rothschild, née Joseph, perished in Theresienstadt a year later. As we saw earlier, Rosa and Zygmunt Nördlinger were murdered in Theresienstadt and Treblinka, respectively, in 1942, and Ida Pollock's mother, Zetchen Joseph, in Auschwitz the following year. Their exchange regarding the fate of their relatives brought Pollock and his Argentinian relations closer together again. Pollock's letters, which although he had begun to communicate with Juan in German again since his return to Europe, had nevertheless continued to be characterized by a notable frigidity ever since his brother's unauthorized contact with Carlotta Pollock's mother, now took on a new warmth, and their mutual trust palpably increased from one letter to the next. What Juan had hoped for in January 1945, that they might be something resembling a family again, was coming true, at least in part. That's the end of chapter 13. Thank you for listening.